So I think what I'd like to do now perhaps is turn it open to you. Perhaps if, I don't know how long this cord extends, if you have questions to our speakers.
If you've got a question, you can come up. Come up here.
Okay, or we'll try, yeah. Or we can repeat it if it's too...
I have a very brief memory to share with you about the alleged anti-Semitism of the British upper classes. I happened to be in the Royal Air Force Club in London, which was the haunt of the senior and middle ranking officers of the Royal Air Force, and the news was coming through on the ticker tape.
Yeah.
I was a junior officer myself, slightly worried about how this would be received, but it was received with jubilation. They were delighted. Oh, the Jews will teach them a lesson at last, at last. So put that alongside.
Thank you. I think you had a question. Yes.
There are just 2 or 3 points I'd like to make, which what to challenge what the speakers had said. The first thing is that I'm the senior past president of the Board of Deputies, and I was a member of the board already in 1956. And at that time, in the November meeting of 1956, Barnard General, the president, was almost torn apart by the deputies, and he was only saved by the fact that Mr. Batsyansky, who was the General Secretary of the Zionist Federation, and also a leading member of the board on the floor of the board, he mobilized people to support Jenner to make sure that he was saved. But the independent people went for him hook, line and sinker. Now, the other thing which I think we ought to also talk about is this. You know, when it came to the Israel involvement with Britain and France at the Sèvres meeting, and even consistently lied to the House of Commons about this, and that he lied to the House of Commons that there was ever any collusion. But what should be understood is the long-term effect for Israel was this. I agree that it showed Israel could act for itself, but there's another point. Israel was established in 1948 after successfully fighting the War of Independence. Now, what often happens after such a situation? The other countries surrounding Israel, it's like neighbors. You don't like a neighbor when he first arrives next to you, but he was a nice sort of fellow and you get on quite well with him. You begin to understand your neighbor and you live with him and you're quite happy with him. But once Israel took part in the collusion with Britain and France, that Israel was no longer seen as a good neighbor in the East, but it was seen as an outpost of the West in the East. And that has really colored the whole attitude of the neighboring Arab states to Israel from that day forth and forevermore. Now, the third point I would like to make is this. I've got Anthony Eden's book here, Full Circle, which is a very, very good... and I just want to quote one thing he said. The course of the Suez Canal crisis was dictated by the American attitude to it. If the United States government had approached the issue in the spirit of an ally, they would have done everything in their power, short of the use of force, to support the nation whose economy depended upon the freedom of passage through the Suez Canal. Now that's Eden himself, and I think one ought to also bear that very, very much in mind. But on the whole question of dealing with Dulles, Selwyn Lloyd in his book, he got on very, very well with Dulles, but it was a clash of personalities. And the final point I'd make is this. You know, there's a wonderful book I've got here called In Health and in Power by David Owen. And he goes very carefully into Eden's health situation throughout the Suez crisis. He was literally drugging himself by day with amphetamines to keep himself awake and drugging himself with barbiturates at night to help him get some sleep. And it may well be But that was also an important factor in the whole situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for your points. Just to reiterate a point, the idea that somehow or other everything was fine between Israel and its neighbours before Israel attacked Egypt is rather contentious, since 1,000 Israelis had been killed and injured as a result of continued raids from Egypt and Jordan was in fact controlled until March 56 by the British Army. And this idea that I've actually seen secret documents where Israel has reached out to have peace agreements with Egypt, and all that was encountered was hatred. In my book on Israel, Britain, Anglo-Jewry, I did relate to the fact that Eddie Relat, who was Israel's the second representative of Israel, he used to meet with Mohammed Fawzi, the Egyptian. They used to meet every week at Lord Rothschild's house on Carlton Street, tasting wine together. Both of them, in fact, had studied together in Beirut. So the idea, I agree, if Israel had in fact said, we want to have good relations with the Arabs, I agree, it was very problematic when you had Israel working with the French and the British. Eden didn't lie to the House of Commons originally. He was economical with the truth. And there is a difference, because no one actually asked him that did the British and the Israelis fight together. In fact, they didn't. No one, in fact, asked him until the 20th of December 1956, did the British know that the Israelis were going to attack first? And this is, I think, important. The last thing about health. I'm glad you mentioned this, because I've mentioned this to Tony before. Health was an issue with Ben Gurion, who suffered for 7 days. He had very bad pneumonia, was in bed the whole time with 42 degrees. Dulles went in for an operation removing a cancer tumor on the 1st. Bulganin, the French Prime Minister, the Russian Soviet Prime Minister, he was in a rehab clinic for alcoholism. And in fact, it seemed to be that people tended to go on. But this, I think, is an important question about neighbours, and just to look at the statistics of how many Israelis had been killed, injured by Arab leaders' policies is incorrect. But it did certainly fuel the flames to justify why Israel wasn't a conductive neighbour.
Sorry, just one quick intervention by Tony for the next question. Sorry, on this. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I think it would be an interesting question, wouldn't it? Why did Eden resign? Could he have got away with it if he hadn't been economical with the truth? Could he have got away with it if Britain had been successful? I mean, there's the conversation between Dulles and Macmillan after the ceasefire, where Dulles turns around to Macmillan and said, "Why did you stop?" Bit rich. And coming just a point on the kind of Eden-Lloyd American relationship. It's fine. Lloyd's been kind of, getting on well with the Americans. The problem is that it's Eden that's driving foreign policy, and had been since the point at which he'd taken over from Churchill. Macmillan, Lloyd, they're not allowed to operate independently. Eden's the Prime Minister. He's the guy who's got 20 years of foreign policy experience. He's the man for foreign affairs. Such a pity.
Mine's just a short question. Is it not true that Eisenhower later regretted bitterly his non-interventionist policy?
Sorry.
I think there's that idea, expressed by Dulles in the kind of November-December period, and kind of picked up by Eisenhower, And certainly the Americans aren't shy under the Eisenhower doctrine of intervening in 58, for example. So I think there is this idea that perhaps American interests in the Middle East, not British interests, but American interests in the Middle East would have been kind of served by perhaps supporting the British. But again, my specialism is the British. If you think about what's lined up against the British, it's not just the Americans, it's the Commonwealth, or much of the Commonwealth. It's the Labour Party. Although public opinion, is be careful about this idea that the British public were against Suez. It's not quite as straightforward as that. But yeah, I take your point about Eisenhower.
Okay, another question.
Didn't Dallas threaten with American intervention?
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. Could you give us a little bit more information about Britain and France's military engagement? You discussed about Israel going in first. What did the Brits and the French actually do militarily?
First of all, according to the Accords of Sèvres, which never exist, the French would bomb, or we call it now softening up, the Egyptian positions in Port Said. If I'm not mistaken, it was the destroyer Lazelle which would do that, while all the Israeli aircraft were bombing Egypt. The French aircraft landed on Israeli bases to protect Israeli airfields if attacked by Egypt, etc. So in terms of this, now what was interesting was that when there was an annex to the protocol in Sèvres, and Anthony Eden, in order not to actually acknowledge it directly, he says, in consultations with the French last night, it was understood that such and such was going to happen. The British were in fact there. So there was a detailed list. On the 1st of November, Prime Minister Anthony Eden, for the record, sends a telegram at 9 o'clock in the morning to Guy Mollet, berating Guy Mollet, I have been informed. Now, if you ever want to be economical with the truth, I always teach my students, never actually say that you know. So when you have been informed, it means that someone's telling you. It doesn't mean to know, doesn't mean to say that you don't know it in advance. I've been informed that French destroyers have been such and such, etc., etc. This information can be extremely embarrassing for the British government, etc. So everything was detailed exactly what would happen. It was the French who were going to be involved militarily helping, and the British knew in advance.
I would just add a caveat to that. The higher levels of the British command in the military know there are some regrettable friendly fire incidents between Anglo-French and Israeli forces. Just responding to what the British actually did, they're part of the softening up process, the bombing campaign by V bombers, the Valiant and Canberras, in preparation for an eventual invasion. There's a parachute assault at Port Said. This is where my kind of memory of dates goes a bit fuzzy. I think on the 3rd of November, and then eventually the invasion convoy, which had sailed from Malta and from Cyprus at about 10 knots, so hardly kind of fast, eventually kind of disgorges its load of troops at Port Said, I think on the 5th or the 6th. As to how successful it is militarily, well, they do get actually about halfway down the canal. And I think Stockwell, the British ground commander, had said, if we'd had another 12 hours, we would have been down the whole length of the canal when the ceasefire intervenes. It does, however, take a week for the invasion convoy to arrive, and that is the problem.
Just one last point. One of the major problems were that the French, the British generals and the admirals were subordinate to the French. It was the French who in fact had the higher positions, and this caused a lot of animosity between the French and the British, not that they needed an excuse.
One final military point. I think also it was the first conflict in which helicopters were used offensively to carry troops.
Just a small point. I seem to remember, but maybe incorrectly, that Dulles threatened Britain and Eden with American intervention against British troops if we carried on with the Suez.
Not that I've seen. I think the intervention is financial.
Run on the pound.
Yeah, it's the run on the pound. And it's the fact is that Britain's oil supply is coming through the canal. I forget the figures for Britain and Western Europe. I think is it 1 million barrels a day or something. I don't know exactly what a barrel of oil looks like, but and the intervention is the run on the pound, and it's a refusal to supply oil to the British.
Can I just I have a question. Can I just before? Just a second. I know. The other thing is there was a myth. There was certainly a myth of the run in the pound, but I actually checked the Bank of England on an hour-to-hour rate.
Yeah.
There was no run on the pound, but there was a threat on the run of the pound, and the threat had its effect.
Yeah, I think the figure was £45 million or something.
Doesn't buy you a football player today.
True.
Am I the last question?
Yes.
Do I have this honor?
As always.
We've heard a hell of a lot about what the British, the Israelis, and the French did, what their motivations, their calculations, their strategy. How about Nasser? What was his motivation? What were the trigger points that made him do what he did? We were affected by his decisions in Egypt, and it would be very interesting to hear what Nasser did and why he did it, and what was the trigger point in his action.
Very good.
It's a very good question. One of the problems is you have experts on Middle East conflict, you have experts on the Arab world, is that when I try to explain to my students that we do not have any access to Arab archives. The Israeli archives are open, the British archives are open, the French archives are open with certain things. So the only thing we have to go on is perhaps Mohammed Haikel, who was his trusted advisor with Al-Ahram, and which is a very important thing. So when we want to know what's going through Eden's psyche, we can look at the documents, we can interview the people, look at the cabinet meetings, but Egypt isn't a democracy. Egypt doesn't have, and neither is Jordan or any other country. So we really honestly do not know what is going through Nasser's psyche, especially in 1967. But we do know that there's one thing, that we as human beings are judged on one thing, and I like the quote in Harry Potter by Professor Dumbledore, it's not what our abilities are, but it's the decisions that we make that define who we are. And I always tell students, so whatever Ben Gurion thought about doing, whatever Churchill thought about doing, for me it's partly irrelevant. What people do, what leaders do, they are in fact responsible. And the main reason, and this is important, the casus belli for the 1956 war was not the mounting of Fedayeen attacks. It didn't appear anywhere in the Israeli protocols. It doesn't appear anywhere. It was because Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran.
Yeah.
That gave Israel the excuse under international law, Article 51 of the UN, and he does it again in 1967. So if only the Egyptians and the Jordanians would open up their archives, we would know a great deal. but we can only go on what leaders do, not what they say. And for the last thing is that we in Israel have a problem. Not all leaders do the opposite of what they say.
The official motivation behind nationalizing the canal was that Britain and the US had refused to finance the High Aswan Dam, and therefore his idea of nationalizing the canal is they would keep the revenues to finance the construction of the dam. And one of the reasons, incidentally, why there was no legal, which you invoked, to attack, is that in his speech on the 26th of July, he explicitly said, and we will compensate the shareholders at the closing rate of the market on the day before.
Yeah. Again, I think just echoing what kind of Natan said, I'm a historian, I kind of tend to work off documents, papers, sources, that kind of stuff, and we just don't have it. So, we're hypothesizing, and as Alec has said, the trigger here is the non-funding of the dam, and the very shrewd move, the compensation, because that puts the British again at a real problem. I mean, what had the British done in 1947-48? Coal mines, steel mines, nationalise the steel works, nationalise them at the market rate. There's probably other things at play. I'm not an Egyptian expert or an expert on Egyptian politics or diplomacy or anything like that. It may well be part of kind of Nasser's, ideas of pan-Arabism and himself as the leader of the Arab world and so on and so forth.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you, yes. Thank you very much indeed. It was a very interesting talk and discussion afterwards as well. I'd like to ask Anne to just come up and give each of you a little gift to remember this conference by in the future.
Thank you very much indeed for your participation.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing everyone in 60 more years. Admir Besri.
Take a seat. Thank you.